I am Margaret Bim, and today is May 24th, 2018. We're at the law offices of Dodson, Parker, Bim, and Caparella, and I am sitting here with my husband, Harlan Dodson, who is the one who is being interviewed today. And this interview is being conducted for the Legal History Project of the Nashville Bar Association. And it's going to be fun, I hope.
Well, you know, I've always been a lot of people in the bar that wanted to shoot me, and they finally got a shot at it.
That's what I mean. So there are only two questions that you are required to answer before we take off. And that is, what is your full name and what is your date of birth?
My full name is Kemper Harlan Dodson III. My date of birth, based on hearsay, is August 3rd, 1944.
So, Harlan, let's talk about first a little bit about your family. I, of course, knew both your parents. Tell us about your mom and dad.
They were both fascinating people, both strong-willed people. My grandfather, on my dad's side, rode a mule from Theta, Tennessee to Nashville back in the 1890s. So that side of the family came from down there. My dad was the first person on that side to go to college. He worked as a plumber to get through law school. My mom's family was from down around Trenton, Tennessee, which is a couple of hundred miles and a couple of hundred years from where we are today. And so when she was of high school age, my grandfather moved all of them to Nashville so they could go to a good high school. And she went to Hume Fogg, where she got 100 in geometry and never let us forget it. So that side of the family, likewise, that was the first generation to go to college.
And so where did your parents meet?
They met because my uncle, Sturdivant, was a fisherman, and he and my dad fished together. And through that, my dad met Mr. Sturdivant's sister, Virginia, and the rest was romantic history.
And both of your parents went to Vanderbilt,
yes,
is that right?
Yeah.
And your dad also, where did he go to law school?
He went to Vanderbilt Law School, where he was founders medalist.
And his father did what for a living?
His father was well, of course, he rode a mule to Nashville, first of all, and he went to bookkeeping school. A lot of the men that came from the country and succeeded here went to bookkeeping school. And so that's how they got involved in business. But he was a bookkeeper. He had a restaurant at one point, told me he'd never get in the restaurant business. Of course I did. But he ended up working along the way at the Nashville Trust Company. And a guy named Sam Fleming had started up a bank, and startup banks were very rare back then, and he wanted my grandfather to build the trust department. But banks didn't raid back then, and so my grandfather left his job, where he was making nearly $4,000 a year, and went to work for a former bookkeeping client of his for 6 months and a day. After 6 months and a day, Sam Fleming called him up, because then it wasn't raiding, and hired him, and he built the trust department at the Third National Bank, where he stayed for the rest of his career.
And your maternal grandfather, what did he do? And I know the moms, I think, were working inside the home to take care of the children and doing all that.
Right. Of course, my grandmother started it also. Every time they opened the door at Westminster Presbyterian, she walked in it. So she was very active in the church. Well, my grandfather Sturdivant was one of the greatest characters in the history of the state of Tennessee. He played semi-pro ball. He was a one-eyed fellow, thought to be the best shot in Tennessee. And he was originally a farm appraiser for the National Life, because down there in the country, he could talk to farmers, and he did great, and he could fish and hunt at the same time. They moved, as I said, to Nashville, and so the kids could go to school, and he was a farm appraiser there in the National Life office, the old building in Nashville, and they came around one day and they said, "Mr. Bob, we've got great news for you. We're reorganizing the National Life, and you're being promoted to vice president in Houston." And he said, "Well, I appreciate that, boys, but I don't want to go to Houston. My kids are here. They don't want to move. I don't want to go to Houston." Now, this is a fellow who, in addition to being the best one-eyed shot in Tennessee, could read Latin and Greek in the original, having taught himself. I mean, he was a bit of a character. He was an inventor. So they said, well, Mr. Bob, it's nowhere else. I mean, it's a reorganization. This is a great, so he said, well, boys, look, in a company as big as the National Life, there's got to be another job. You go find it. So they came back and they said, well, Mr. Bob, you got to go to Houston. The only other job we've got is parking cars in the parking lot downstairs. And he said, I'll take it. So rather than being the vice president in Houston, he took over parking. And, of course, every morning he was there, and he's a cheerful fellow. He'd get there, all the people would show up, all worried to death. He'd park the cars. The chairman, on a couple of occasions, was known to say, you know, Bob Sturman's the smartest guy we got. He loves his job, and he doesn't have any stress. And he built an inventor's shop down there, and he just lived happily ever after. Thank you very much.
So your mom and dad were quite the twosome, great people. Tell us about what it was like growing up with these two as your parents.
Well, of course, they were both wonderful. I mean, but you didn't know that because you assumed they were wonderful. But it was, you know, it was so interesting back then. My dad was one of the most prominent lawyers in town, but we only had one car. And since Mother would be driving the three of us, she kept the car, and my dad and a bunch of the other, out there on Tyne Boulevard, a bunch of the other people of the lawyers, Big Johnson, all those people would ride the bus to town. Talking about transit. They'd ride the bus to town because none of them had two cars. I still remember we got the second car. I mean, it was just a big thing. But we're up in the 50s, it's you going on. I mean, you have one car, and the guys all got on the bus and rode the bus to town together.
And you said your dad was prominent in the community. What did he do?
Well, he was a lawyer. He was very active in various things. He was head of the Chamber of Commerce at one point. You know, all those things people got elected to. He had been a member of the state legislature. There was a group of people around Nashville, a group of men, of course, who sort of made the decisions. They were loosely described in history now as the Watauga group, but really it was not, it was more informal than that. But they all kind of got together and discussed problems and figured out when something needed to be done, such as metro government.
What did he do regarding the formation of the metropolitan?
Well, he was a strong believer in metro government. In fact, one of the first things I remember, I was about age 6 or 7, is riding around putting cards in mailboxes opposing the city of Oak Hill because he didn't believe in the balkanization as much as we love Oak Hill. But he believed that we needed to have metropolitan government because he was a great believer that everybody needed to get together and solve problems as a community versus each person looking out for themselves. And so the first question is, you had to amend the Tennessee Constitution. So they came up with the idea of having a limited constitutional convention to have only specific issues on it. So they got the legislation passed to have a limited constitutional convention. Then they had to litigate that in the state Supreme Court to determine that it was constitutional to have a limited constitutional convention. He was involved in that. Then they elected the members of the limited constitutional convention, and he ran for and was elected, and was a major, nobody much on earth has ever read the volume of the proceedings, but if you read, he was really a key in that, and I have a letter from him where he discusses like what he was doing, but he was a great person to have strong opinions, but to move toward a place that everybody could work. And if he couldn't get everybody there, he didn't get mad, he just worked on what he wanted. So he was very active in the Constitutional Convention, which changed the Constitution to allow you to have metropolitan government. That was known as local option. That meant there had to be some way to do it. So he ran for the state Senate in '56 for the avowed purpose of passing the enabling legislation for metropolitan government. And way before everybody else, he was the classic one-termer. He said, I'm only running one time. I don't have to owe anybody anything. And he ended up doing all these fascinating things while he was there, but he passed the legislation which allowed you to have a metropolitan government in a Then he was on the first charter commission that drafted the world's perfect charter, which of course lost. Then he was on the second charter commission, which drafted the less perfect charter under which we're now operating, which passed. And so he was a part of that whole process. He and Beverly Briley, which makes our friendship with David fun, he and Beverly Briley were great friends and co-conspirators as the county group. And So then he helped Beverly get elected as the first metropolitan mayor.
Of course, you're a young boy when all this is going on, and
Still
getting
am.
into getting into teenage years. And while he was doing all of that, I know this had an impression on you. I want to talk about that, but he also was on the school board at one point. And how did both of those things, the charter activity and the school board, affect you?
Well, the charter was just interesting because he would, older people will sit and talk to younger people, and sometimes it's interesting. And it was fascinating to me what he was talking about how government worked, how a metropolitan system would improve or unimprove, and how it made this person's problem, and his problem's that person's problem, and that way we had to get together and solve them. But my funny story, the school board back then was appointed. And so it was the worst thing you could ask anybody to do is be on the school board. So Beverly called my dad and asked him to be on the school board. And my dad said, I don't want to do that. I don't get along with those people. And he said, no, I need you on there. So my dad agreed to do it. I was in the 8th grade at Burton School. My main interest in life was, of course, playing football. I was on my way to Hillsborough. I'd already talked to the coaches over there. All my friends were going there. My dad walked in one day in the spring and he said, Beverly's asked me to be on the school board. And I agreed. And, I've thought about you going to Hillsborough, it'd probably put you in a difficult position. Old folks will lie to you, by the way. He thought I'd take advantage of it. It took me years to figure that out. So he said, we're going to go down and see BGA. I'd never heard of a BGA. We get in the car and we drive about 800 miles down a 2-lane road called Franklin Road through fields and such, and we finally get to a falling down house on the Columbia Pike, which was BGA. And I didn't know anybody. I didn't have any idea why I'm going there. Best thing that ever happened. When I got to college, I pre-qualified in all these sophomore courses. They had me totally ready. Had a great time. It was a wonderful place to be. It was a fabulous experience. I'm still an alumni, strong supporter, et cetera. But that's how my dad being on the school board influenced me. It got me to not go where I was going to school, thank you very much.
So where did you go to school before you got to BGA?
I started out at Taylor Stratton out in Madison, and then we moved across town, and so I went to Robertson Academy, where I could ride my pony over there on the weekends and just let the pony graze, and then I could play on the playground, then ride back in time for dinner. And then I got rezoned to Burton, so I went to Burton School, which went through the 8th grade then, and from there, I was dragged away to BGA.
Two things I really hear about BGA a lot. It's the football team and the debate team. Can you tell us how that went for you?
We had all kind of fun things. We also set the world's record for that college quiz buster thing, which is, one of those things that's all. But football, I loved. I was a mediocre football player on a great football team. I had great coaches. My line coach, who was known as GOAT, thank you very much, was also my math teacher, who, in addition to teaching things in the old way, as I say, qualified me for second-year stuff when I got to college. But football was fun. I mean, it really teaches you what you put into it, you get out of it. I ran track, which I loved, the same sort of thing. I mean, you learn really kind of what you put into it, you get out of it. Speaking was always fun because what we would do is, there was another friend of mine and I, we would be a debate team most of the year. We were fortunately undefeated in Tennessee. But then when we would get to the tournaments, I would go in extempt, and he did original oratory. So I never debated in the tournaments. I won the state in extempt, because debate, you got to work. Extempt, all you do is sit there in the room and talk with other people in the room, and they come in and give you a topic, and 5 minutes later you talk about it. Sometimes 10. But
I think your football team won state, too.
We won state, yes.
So how'd you get to college? What college did you choose, and how'd you get there?
Well, I ended up at Duke University by sheer accident. Like, I've always been good at not making decisions that turned out well. And so my football coach and baseball coach was Ralph Brown, who ended up being my client, which is one of my great compliments of all the people he ever coached. But he had gone to Wake Forest, where he played baseball. And so we had what's called Beta Club, and if you were in that, you didn't have to go to study hall. You could sit out there and screw off, and then people would come and you'd help them with their homework. And Coach would come in and sit down with us and talk, and he'd always talk about the Demon Deacons and all about ACC. And so he used to talk about them Blue Devils. And he walked in there one day and he said, Harlan, I think you'd make a great Blue Devil. You ought to go to Duke. And I looked into it, and everything sounded good. It was all wrong, but it sounded good. So I applied what they had early decision back then. You weren't stuck, but you could do it. So I applied. So when I started my senior year in high school, I was already into Duke, and everything I heard about it was good. So I didn't bother to apply anywhere else, and that's how I ended up in North Carolina at Duke University, starting school in September, having never been in the state of North Carolina before the day I started school. So,
before we get to Duke, did you have some jobs when you were in high school?
Yeah, I primarily ran hay crews and worked horses. So you'd get there on Monday through Thursday, you'd cut hay. And then on Friday, you'd put the horses and the buggies and everything on in the truck, and you'd go up and work those county shows, county fair shows all over southern Kentucky. So that was kind of a fascinating sort of world.
So 6'3", mid-200s, defensive lineman, doing hay crews. And
well, actually, at that point, I was 6'3", offensive and defensive lineman, thank you very much, and 170. I found a way in college to add some weight.
So tell us a little bit about college. What did you major in?
I majored in, back then you could do all kinds of things. I had a history major with political science and comparative literature. It was a great place to go. There were all these incredibly bright people from the South and the Northeast who had gone to all these really fancy schools and all, so you felt a little odd, but it found out that, kind of didn't make a lot of difference, and just made a lot of really good friends and a lot of different people, and really it was a very, very broadening experience.
And in the summers, did you stay in North Carolina? Did you come?
No, I actually worked in the circuit court clerk's office in Davidson County, which was a wonderful way to learn how the court system worked and get to know people. And also, you could, if a major lawyer was trying something, everybody knew that everybody in the courthouse was going to be sitting in the courtroom listening to them. So you just weren't expected to work if, Mr. Norman or Mr. Hooker or one of those lawyers, Mr. Binkley, was arguing.
So what made you decide to go to law school?
Well, I'd sort of always been around law. I mean, I just liked it. My mind sort of worked that way. And I considered various other things, but nothing else really seemed to have the flexibility or the challenge.
Now, I know before you went to law school, you were also interested in politics. Mm-hmm. What were you doing politically before you went to law school? Well,
of course, I grew up around all the races that my dad was involved in and all that. And of course, we were all Clement people, so we always went to the Clement openings. My dad coached Clement for the bar exam, and that was one of his close advisors always. So we always kind of around that. But my most interesting early race was when I was at Duke. I was dating a woman, and her uncle was a former professor at Duke. He lived just outside the county line on a little old farm. And they didn't have metro government, and so they had a city group and a county group. And the city group was sort of the Duke professor-y kind of people, and the county group was the other people who lived on farms, and they didn't always agree, to put it mildly. So he was hoping to win a county commissioner's seat with the city group. So I just said, well, I can do something about that. So I got a bunch of the signs in my old Corvair, and I went to all those intersections around the county where, they'd be a little store there, and you'd walk in, sit down, nod with your elders, talk a little bit, and say I'm helping my friend Howard, and he's running for county commissioner, and he didn't believe in annexation for other reasons. And they'd say, well, where is it? I said, well, he used to be a teacher at Duke, and they'd all kind of look back. I said, he's got this little farm right outside the city, and he doesn't believe in annexation, and he's running for county commissioner. Well, I don't believe in that annexation either. We'd talk a little while, and then I'd get a poster up, and that, you didn't have everybody's poster. If you put a poster up that window, that meant that little county corner was supporting him. And so he ran way ahead of the city group and got elected to the county commission, thank you very much, because we did real well out there in the county, and that was just a lot of fun.
So that was your real first organization?
That was my first year, my grassroots organization.
So you went to law school what years?
I got there late, showing how my career would be. I started in the fall of '66 and graduated in the spring of '69.
And you went to what law school and why?
I went to Vanderbilt because I just wanted to come home and do that. Duke was nice enough to offer me the opportunity to stay there, but it just seemed like you'd come home and go to Vanderbilt. Again, it wasn't a brilliantly thought through decision, it was just a brilliant decision.
So tell us what it was like being a law student at Vanderbilt for you.
Well, I think by the nature of being a lawyer, you always are a bit lazy, it's kind of like, and so I'd kind of eased my way through school, and I decided I was going to law school, I had to get serious. So they had those things back then called horn books, which were the real treatises, and so I had read the treatises on 3 of the subjects before I began. And when I started out, they had those, I don't know what law books like now, but they'd have a case, and then they'd have these note cases in there. So I'd read the case, and then I'd read all the note cases, and I'd read the things they referenced you to, and then I'd ask questions in class, and it occurred to me nobody else was doing that, and professors hadn't read the note cases usually, and some professors were awesome. I mean, like Dean Wade. I mean, what more can you say? But I was the first person called on the first day. Dean Wade, of course, knew my father, called on me just by accident. The case was Weaver versus Ward. And he asked them, I stood up, stood at attention and did Weaver versus Ward and what it was in the King's Bench and why it was important. And the reason was someone fired in a militia exercise, fired a musket and unintentionally injured someone. And Weaver versus Ward is a case that ruled that you could have damages for an accidental rather than an intentional matter. And of course, I'd read all this stuff while sitting out in Rainier being a ranger because I read all this stuff in advance. And so by the end of my first semester, it was kind of obvious that I was probably putting in more energy than I needed to, but I was doing okay. Second semester, they had a professor there who they shouldn't have there because he wasn't showing up, and he kind of quit showing up. And so I kind of quit showing up too, but I still came some. I was working at the firm full time. And so the fellow that became the dean, they turned to him and said, "You got to teach the property course, because we finally decided the professor we've been acting like wasn't showing up isn't going to ever show up again." So what he did, he called us, me and 2 others in. He said, "All right, guys, here's the deal. We're going to teach property. I don't know property. Here's property in a nutshell, and here's the property book. You guys are going to read ahead. I'm going to read ahead, and you don't get to ask me questions. If I have a question, I'm going to ask y'all." And that's how, in 6 weeks, with all the property law I've done since, that's how I learned property law in 6 weeks. And I basically didn't show up at law school again, unless I just had to for something. So the next couple of years.
I assume you showed up to take an exam.
I showed up for exams, yeah, and was fortunate enough to do okay on them. Because what I'd do at the beginning of the year, I would read a horn book, and I would read the case book. And so then everybody else would go to class and take all these notes. But, the nature of that, you don't have any idea what's going on. I mean, it's the most disorganized way to teach anything on earth. And so then when we got ready to study for exams, we'd all sit down, and these people would babble something the professor had said, and I could tell what was different or what was important but I actually knew what the table of contents looked like. And so I was very useful in that when we studied together. So I was fortunate enough to do okay.
You said you did okay. How did you do in law school?
If we were on a 4.0, I was a 3 minor something or another. I mean, it was not, I was certainly in the upper small group, but.
You are on the law review.
I was on the law review, yes, and that was fascinating because I was there in the summer, and we actually did a China trade article, and no one had ever done a China trade article, and so we had to blue book it. And blue booking, is this highly technical thing, but you couldn't blue book it because nobody had ever blue booked this stuff. So we made up the site forms for all this China material and did the China thing. Thereafter, they and I had a sort of a different attitude about how serious we should be. I was the Christmas tree editor. I every Christmas would show up with a Christmas tree and a group of friends smelling strongly of spirits, and we would put up the Christmas tree in the law review office as all these pale wand people looked at it, decorate it, and leave. So occasionally leave a precedent or two underneath it. So that was my major contribution to the law review after my China article.
So did you spend most of the time at the law office when you weren't at law school?
Yes.
So what were you getting out of that versus going to law school?
I just was a practicing lawyer from about 1967 on.
Before you had a law license, were you able to try a case?
Yeah, life was more informal back then, and so yes, I either actually got a verdict in 2 cases or 3. I don't remember exactly, but I was undefeated trial work before I got a license, because you'd be over there and one of the lawyers was tied up in another court, so I would go down and say, Judge so-and-so, Mr. Keeble's tied up down there in this court, and he said it'll be a little while, and, Judge looked and say, well, Mr. Dodson, you draw this pleading, didn't you? I said, yes, sir, I did. Yes, Your Honor, I did. And he said, well, you know how to put a case on, don't you? I said, well, I do, I guess so, And he'd say, all right, well, present your matter, and I'd present the matter, and, this is Mr. So-and-so, and you file this lawsuit, and this is what, and they'd ask questions, and the judge say, all right, I rule for the plaintiff, draw an order, and, or, the summary judge, whatever it might be. So I would actually got the opportunity to try and win cases prior to having a license.
I also think you ran for office.
Yes.
Prior to getting your license.
Right. A friend of mine named Norman Lane, who was this incredibly brilliant, strange person, got killed in Vietnam. And that was one of those sort of experiences where you felt like, gosh, I ought to be doing something. And Tommy Wiseman had put together that group of independent legislators in the House. They call them the Mountain, of course, after the French Revolution group. And he ran in '68 for the state Senate. And a group of us around the state ran for the House. He lost because he fell off a horse and broke his leg. And we were all doing pretty well, won our primaries. Going into the general, they had a convention in a city called Chicago in 1968, which did not augur well for young liberal candidates. And so I was fortunate enough, once again, showing the clever decision-making, which my life has exemplified, to lose. So I didn't end up in the legislature.
So what was your district you were running in?
It essentially is Oak Hill, Forest Hills, Belmead.
And you ran as a Democrat, of course.
Yeah, and won the Democratic primary, kind of contested, and lost really close, but lost, fortunately.
So I think you've kind of given us assessment of your law school curriculum, but just kind of in a nutshell, what did you think about law school?
One, I loved the people I got to know in law school. The relationships, the conversations were great. We had some great professors. I thought it was probably the most disorganized way to try to communicate information in the history of the world.
And just mention, if you would, 2 or 3 professors that really did have an impact on you.
Well, of course, Dean Wade was the one. I mean, he looked at you, God, was nothing compared to Dean Wade looking at you. Hal Mayer, who taught conflicts and such interesting concepts as Renvoy, was one of the few. He was just brilliant, but he was so brilliant he could explain things in a way you enjoyed it. Bob Covington taught courses that you never, he taught an insurance course that I've faked the insurance law ever since, with a book that was totally old. He taught agency and partnership. I've won 3 cases in argument, 1 in the state Supreme Court, 2 in the Sixth Circuit, arguing partnership law, simply quoting the principles that he taught me. It was some of those professors were just wonderful.
I know this from my own experience, you remember a lot that you learned in law school, no matter how you learned it.
Well, I think that's right, but I think part of that is people that can explain it conceptually, as opposed to the case method, thank you very much, but conceptually, you can remember it.
So let's talk about, I think your early career kind of morphed. You did get a law license, but you were doing a lot of practical legal work in the law firm. Is that where you went upon getting your law license?
Yes.
To the law firm? Mm-hmm. Describe your law firm at that time. Who's there? How big it is, how it relates to the rest of the legal community?
Well, Gareth Ayton, my good friend, and I joined at the same time. And that got us up to 8, so we were tied for the largest firms in town. Mr. Hooker Sr., who was one of the great lawyers ever, was there. David Keeble, who was just one of the best lawyers on earth. My dad, Mr. Tyree Harris III, who was just the mills of God grind slowly but exceeding small. When he got through with a problem, it was done. John Kelly was there as an associate, who went off and became Ortel Kelly. There were another person there, and I'm blanking on a name probably. So we came aboard, and it was the premier firm in Tennessee, really, in a way. I mean, if you were anywhere outside of Davidson County, I mean, you didn't go to federal court. You didn't go to Nashville. You didn't go to Court of Appeals. You'd call up and hire that firm. I mean, that way if you won, you got credit for winning. If you lost, they couldn't say anything about you. But, a country lawyer, which is anywhere than Davidson County, would not go to federal court. And for appeals and matters like that, they just expected to hire Nashville lawyers. So that firm would get all of that. And the other fun thing about it, though, is they'd hire the firm to help on cases all over the state. Well, Mr. Hooker wasn't going to get in a car and drive to Lake County. So, from the time I started practicing, I would go try cases in these other counties. I think I tried something I think it's 45 to 50 counties. And that was just a wonderful experience to get to know people and the state and how to try cases.
What was John J. Hooker Sr. like?
He was a larger-than-life character. We don't have anyone like that anymore. He was incredibly bright, but he cared about people. I mean, he could work with the jury so well because I remember the elevator operator and the building. Mr. Hooker asked him about his operation, and he was talking about the scar. Mr. Hooker said, well, let me look at it. The guy pulls his shirt up, and Mr. Hooker looks at the scar and really cares about it. Well, I mean, that's the kind of thing he could do with the jury. He also had an incredible ability to get to the absolute little point that made the difference. But here's the preeminent lawyer in the Southeast, but he thought my little cases were fascinating. So he'd come in, if he didn't have an appointment, 10 o'clock in the morning, but he'd have been sitting out there. He had read all the Sixth Circuit opinions. He read all these things. I mean, so he would just want to discuss my little cases and was just fast. He was more interested in my little cases than his big cases, just because he was a true lawyer's lawyer.
And Mr. Keeble, what was it like practicing with
Mr.
someone
Keeble,
like him?
he was amazing. He was very, very bright. He was very practical. He was a part of a society that we don't have anymore. It was a true society. He, of course, was an active member of the Bellmead Country Club and was kin by marriage or otherwise to all the people that are kin to each other, in Tennessee and Kentucky and all. And so he was the person who knew all the history of the Caldwell families and their trust, the Berries and their trust, all of those old Nashville families. He knew all of them and how their trusts and relationships worked, a lot of them multi-generational, and just was an excellent lawyer, but he was incredibly efficient. I mean, he would get there late, he would leave early, and he'd get more work done in that time than most people got done in a week.
And, your dad also was doing some estate planning in addition to all the work that you've already described. His dad was in the trust department, too.
And estate planning back then was a will. A will was something you charged $25 for.
So describe what it's like to have a law firm that has 8 lawyers doing everything, as you described.
And it's wonderful because it's so collegial. Now, it's a different world. At about 5 o'clock or so, Mr. Hooker would walk down the hall and say, lawyer, let's go back to the library. And we'd all go back to that big library. And either a porter, or when we didn't have a porter, the young lawyer present, which was me, would get out the ice, get out the glasses, open the Jack Daniels, and of course you threw the cap into the trash can. And everybody'd sit back there and talk. And it was amazing. So they'd get to talking, well, what about that such and such? You remember that case came down up in Obion County? What was it? 48? Harlan, go up. So they'd be talking. They did a lot of constitutional work and arguing about whether statutes were constitutional, all this kind of thing, all over the state. So, you'd go track down something in this case that came out of Obion County, and read it. And so much of the history of the law and the state politics and all came through them. I mean, it was just, they went back to the beginning of time. And as you know, and I won't get us into it in detail, Mr. Walker, who was the Walker and Hooker, was the Speaker of the House when they passed the suffrage amendment, not with his strong support, shall we say. Mr. Hooker, who was much younger, a very good athlete, kin to him by marriage, was actually the page that tried to chase down the absconding member and couldn't catch him. So, I mean, they went back to the history all the way back to beginning of the 20th century in Tennessee politics. So.
And talk about the importance of this library. I mean, how big was it in relation to where you would find other information?
It was the largest private law library in the state of Tennessee. It was larger than, it was not as big as Vanderbilt's. It was not as big as the state Supreme Court. I believe at that time it was larger than UT's. It was certainly comparable. But we had, you know, for example, the Decennial Digest, the Reporter System, all this amazing stuff, so that nobody had.
Of course, there weren't computers, so.
Nobody had met a computer yet outside of the physics departments.
And of course, there weren't separate business sections or whatever. Everybody did a lot of the same work.
Yeah, everybody was expected to kind of know everything. It was changing as I got there, because remember, I was fortunate enough, again, with my great decision making, we passed the Uniform Commercial Code in '66. We passed the new Corporations Act 68-69. The 69 tax code came down, significantly changing the tax code. So much of what the law was, the business law was, and the securities law had changed and evolved in the late 60s, and I was involved there. So much of the law that was on the business side had changed from what everybody knew. And of course, as the young lawyer, it's what I knew, so I don't see why these people kept saying it's something different. They've done it to us again, by the way. But it was fascinating. So I was in the fortunate position of knowing things that nobody else knew there or most of anywhere else that were related to business.
How much did you make when you started practicing law?
Now, we got $9,600 a year. I thought we could talk about it a little more because I had all these credentials, you know, National Moot Court Finals, Law Review, blah, 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 high average, but we didn't. We got $9,600. A couple of the firms had actually gone above that. But in Memphis at that point, you made like $5,000 or $5,500. I can't remember for sure if you were married, and $1,000 less if you were single. So we were still way ahead of Memphis, which we've continued.
What did you do those first years? You know, what kind of cases did you handle?
Well, of course, you know, again, with my decision-making skills, I planned to try cases. That's what you do. I tried jury cases. Most of those were automobile accidents, some of them property disputes, a few business disputes. So I started out trying accident cases. You know, there's nothing unusual about trying 2 jury cases a week back then. Certainly, you plan to try 1 a week. In the midst of that, by sheer accident, I ended up getting some friends who had gotten arrested on a marijuana charge off before the night judge, which wasn't supposed to do this, but he had a hearing, and we suppressed the search warrant, and he let them go, and people thought I knew something about this. Back then, marijuana was a felony, punishable by 2 to 5 in the state penitentiary. And as the Buffett song says, only jazz musicians were smoking marijuana. And so nobody knew what it was. And understandably, the police would walk into a party, there'd be 1 marijuana cigarette and 15 kids, and they'd arrest 15 kids and charge them with a felony. And the criminal lawyers, not wrongly, would say, well, it's a felony, our minimum fee for a felony is $1,500. Well, I sort of saw it as a traffic offense. So I'd, you know, take the group of them and say, I'll charge each of you $50, let's go do it. So nobody ever got a search right. If it got a search right, they couldn't get the indictment right. So it was 2 years before any of the search warrants held up. And it was about 1.5 years before they could get an indictment to hold up. So by sheer accident, I was the drug lawyer, and then I got to be the draft lawyer because those people, I got hired in one of those cases and was fortunate enough to win it in front of Frank Gray over there in federal court. So people thought I knew something about that. So, I picked up this practice, again, with my planning skills by sheer accident for those two things, which is what people know you for. At the same time, I had been out of law school briefly. Mr. Hooker walked in one day and said, Harlan, our old friends and clients, the Eskins, have got this issue that's arisen, and their brother-in-law, who was, of course, Kenny Bialkin, that did Scat and Arps and did all those interesting things, is coming down. They are talking about doing something called a Chapter 11. I stayed at the office that night and read the one Collier volume on Chapter 11. There'd never been a Chapter 11 filed in the Middle District. So I was the only person in the Middle District that ever knew anything about Chapter 11, so we ended up filing it. We're fortunate enough to confirm a plan pretty quickly, and
So you were the first Chapter 11.
I was the first Chapter 11. Margaret Bem was the first Chapter 12 in Middle Tennessee, by the way. But it was fascinating, so I did some of those, and we had some success with those. That led to doing a fair amount of workout practice, because it's sort of a cycle. When I started out, everybody was merging and growing and doing all this stuff. Of course, then you go through everybody getting broke. That led me to trying a bunch of securities fraud lawsuits for people that were directors and all like that. So up through 75, 76, that's kind of the odd mix I'd picked up. I'd also picked up a business practice in there because we were getting more and more business practice. And by the nature of the technical stuff that was happening, more and more of it sort of dropped on my plate because, well, gosh, we have a new corporate law, and you got to worry about all this stuff. And, the tax law had changed markedly so that people's reactions were wrong. And, of course, in the midst of all that, I'd lobbied through the rules, so that had changed.
Which rules? The
Tennessee Rules of Civil Procedure. I was hired as special counsel to lobby the rules through the legislature in '70. And it was a real battle. People didn't want those darn rules. Nobody wanted the federal rules, of course, so we pointed out these weren't the federal rules, these were the Kentucky rules. You probably guessed the next step in the discussion. But in any event, we managed to get them passed. We got them passed despite some really clever maneuvering by some really good legislators. We took it through, and I won't get you into this real deeply, but most times you take it through one house or the other in the committees. I took it through both houses in the committees. So when somebody pulled a trick on us in the House, we were able to pass it in the Senate. We passed it in the Senate by one vote when I had the Sergeant at Arms run one member out of the restroom back onto the floor. So if you like the rules, I'll take credit for them. If not, it was that Sergeant at Arms' fault, not mine.
So let me ask you, though, you talked about trying 2 jury cases a week, but then there's discovery in those rules. What about that?
Well, discovery, of course, as you know, has changed everything. My dad, while in the legislature those 2 years, passed the Discovery Deposition Act. Prior to that, there was no legal way to take a discovery deposition. He always said it wasn't his other behavior that would get him sent to hell. It would be passed in the Discovery Act because that was the start of all that came after. But discovery was this new thing. I mean, and courts didn't believe in it. The judges had all grown up before the discovery days. So you just didn't, I mean, it was not unusual to have a case in which there were no depositions. I mean, you basically somebody put a witness on the stand, you had to handle a witness.
Talk a little bit about what you did to get to know other lawyers. You're obviously working very hard and doing a lot of different kinds of law, and your practice is different, whether it's business practice or trying cases, and you're traveling all over the state doing it. But talk about what you did to get to know other lawyers during that time.
Well, it was a variety of things, all of which were not decisions. They just happened. I mean, the smartest decision I made was enjoying drinking a beer. So early on, about the time we got our licenses, I sort of set up an informal group at the Gerst House, which was right around the corner on 2nd, right off the square. on Friday afternoons, everybody, sort of about a 3-year age group, was invited. Nothing formal, you just would show up. There were about 20 to 25 people that would flow in and out, and we all got to know each other. And, you know, a lot of the people you got to know that way were somebody who you wouldn't ever get to know otherwise. And you ended up people, but you had all these friends, and over the years, even though you hadn't seen you in 10 years, you know, if I had a case or they needed help from me, they could call me. If I needed help, I could call them. You know, John Buffalo, who became the lead creditor lawyer here, was part of that group, and you could call over there and say, now, John, my old buddy Bob from high school, you know, he's kind of got some creditor problems, and, you know, John could help you, or, you know, somebody would call and say, you know, Harlan, I've got somebody that needs a lawyer. He's probably not going to be able to pay you, but he needs somebody over in Sessions can help him out of this. Well, you know, I could go over and do that. You know, but it was all this relationship. In addition, of course, we had the Nashville Bar Association. You always went to a bar event. We had the Tennessee Bar. You went to that. But the other thing is you lived at the courthouse. You had motions that are, you know, Mr. Norman was famous for saying he didn't return phone calls because anybody he wanted to talk to, he would see at the courthouse. So it was a collegial world. Now, when I started, there were 350 lawyers in Nashville. So.
And what was it like to get to know lawyers?
Well, lawyers went out of the way to get to know you. I mean, older lawyers, even Mr. Andrew Ewing or someone like that, would speak to you pleasantly, or to their best job of pleasantly. I mean, and when you were walking down the street with an older lawyer and they saw a young lawyer they didn't know, they would want to make sure to get to know his name. I mean, you just assumed you knew the lawyers.
Okay. You talked about the network that you formed with, you know, other lawyers at the Gerst House. What did you notice about your dad? How was he networking with other lawyers?
Well, I mean, first of all, he knew all of them and went out of his way to talk to them. But it was such a different world then, Margaret. You know, we're now so busy and have electronics and all. Back then, all the lawyers, if you weren't trying a case you'd have coffee in the courthouse, would have somewhere they'd go to have coffee in the mornings. And you just sort of get there about 10 o'clock and spend 30, 45 minutes drinking coffee with your friends. So, of course, there was the Stallman Building Group. My dad's group would go over to Zager's, which was there on 4th Avenue where Metropolitan Federal, or whatever it now, the building is, was located. And so there was sort of a loose group of show up. The people I remember this particular morning that I'm telling you about, my dad was there, Mr. Berry was there from Bass, Berry & Sims, Mr. Tribune was there from Tribune Sturdivant. I'm pretty sure Dick Lanston was there. He was there a lot from Waller Lanston, and then 2 or 3 other people would have been there. There'd been 6 or 7 around the table. And one of them said, oh, by the way, I want everybody to know that good young lawyer over there with the U.S. Attorney's Office, Irving Kilcrease, is leaving and setting up his practice. They said, oh, when? And they knew when it was. And they said, well, okay, we've got to make sure we all send him some business. You know, what do we have we can send him so we'll know he'll succeed? Because at that point, if a young lawyer went out and set up a firm, set up a business, everybody would make sure he succeeded. If he needed a little bit of work, one of the title companies would, you know, the title companies really were the way a lot of the young lawyers got started because they put that work out to go over there to the courthouse and look in those books and all like that. So today, I mean, it's economically wouldn't be, but the lawyers looked after the lawyers, including bringing along the young lawyers.
And as a young lawyer, you were an associate. What did it take to become a partner in your law firm? Well,
it was very informal back then, of course. I just, because I was a son, told them when I got there that if I didn't want to be one of those legacies that hung on. If I wasn't a partner in 2 years, I was easing on down the road. And I was fortunate enough to be one. So,
you've talked about some major cases that you had in your early days. As you moved on in your practice, what were some other noteworthy cases that you remember?
Well, of course, you know, as a lawyer, you remember the lawyering side versus the world-ending side. One of the most interesting cases, because I had this sort of, was helping people in these minor drug cases, I had this guy come to see me and wanted me to represent him on a case in Williamson County. Now, That's a whole different world down there. And so he and two other fellows were riding around out in the country, and he was riding shotgun, and there was a driver and a boy in the back seat, and they were pulled over because they had long hair probably, but they were pulled over by the highway patrol, and the highway patrolman searched the car, and he found a pencil box in the car beside the console, but on the shotgun side with some marijuana in it. And so they indicted them all for felony possession of marijuana. Two of the boys hired real lawyers and pled guilty and had an agreement they'd get a year. And my guy couldn't afford a real lawyer, so he got me, and I'd never tried a criminal jury case. So we got down there and picked a jury, and Judge Henderson has the former DA, and General Bates was the current DA. He was one of the great DAs ever. Judge Henderson was one of the great DAs ever, so there was a sense that you had two of the best DAs in the state in the courtroom. But the kind of quality of and how it was more informal then, Judge Henderson called me back there and General Bates, and he said, General Harlan, I want to make sure y'all know this. The other two defendants have pled guilty in this case. And of course, the general, being a general, yes, and he said, I just want everybody to know, I don't know how this case is going to come out. We've never had a defense verdict in a marijuana case in Williamson County. So I don't know what's going to happen here, but there's a good chance this young man's going to get convicted. And I just want to tell you, General, he's going to get the same thing as the guys that pled, because he's not going to be penalized for having his constitutional right to a trial. Well, of course, the DAs used that if you go to trial, you're going to have a worse result as a way to get people. So that's, maybe one of the great DAs, but he's also a heck of a judge. We had a gunfight. General Bates was great. I mean, he'd get up there and he'd read the indictment like the voice of God. And he was getting up a jury box. And I said, Johnny can't get up there. Well, he can. You understand? So I got up in the jury box too. So both of us were in the jury box at one point having a heated conversation. Judge Henderson found that funny. But case went on, and they were going on about how, that they found this marijuana in the car, and that my young man was in that car. So if you'll hand me that little box you got right there, the evidence was a pencil box that they had found in the car, right? And it was sitting up there. Well, I had seen it, so I went down to the supply store, and I bought me this pencil box. It's the very same pencil box. And I put it, before trial started, in the witness box, right where it would be beside the left foot of the witness. And so I would interview the witnesses. They, of course, had the highway patrolman and the court clerk, who, everybody in the county knew, just great guy. And so we went back and forth, and their whole argument was he had to know about it. And so my closing argument was that it's a proximity rule here. If this was moonshine, nobody would say you were guilty of it because it's marijuana. What they're saying is if you're within 6 feet of it, you're guilty. So, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you're within 6 feet. Of course, I had their box then, within 6 feet of it. Are y'all guilty? What about this trained investigator, the highway patrolman? Wouldn't he have noticed it? And then Joe, Joe, the court clerk that everybody knows, would he be guilty of marijuana? And everybody kind of looked at me, and I saw they reach in there in the witness box, and I pull out this box. And I said, they didn't mention this box. If it's marijuana in this box, is Officer so-and-so, is Joe guilty of possession? Well, I'm in the jury box now with him. Are y'all guilty of possession of marijuana? Do you know there's marijuana in this box? And everybody's then general's jumping up and screaming, and everybody's running around in circles. And I said, all right, here it is. You know what marijuana looks like? Oop, there's nothing in there. So they went out and stayed out a long time, and they came back, and the foreman, Henderson said, have you chosen a foreman? And this fella who, he was not, shall we say, probably a strong liberal, got up and they said, yes, we have, and it's Mr. Joe Smith here. Mr. Smith got up, he said, have the jury reached a verdict? He said, yes. Is it unanimous? Yes. What is the verdict? And he said, we find the defendant not guilty of the felony of marijuana. So it was kind of fun. I mean, that...
and you've kept that box in your
I've kept that box to remind me, every once in a while you have to think a little bit outside the box.
So as far as some other cases, I think there are two that you mentioned to me. One that has to do with an antitrust case with the realtors, and just a little bit about your appellate history too.
Well, it was fun. Of course, back then, as I say, you know, appeals was a very specialized area. So I was doing a lot of appeals because it's fun. I mean, you first of all, you have to write a brief, and that's analytical. Then you have to be able to talk on your feet, and you got a short period of time to try to get it done. Judges were very, and I'm not saying they're not today, but were very engaged then. You could expect a hot court, a lot of questions. So I was doing a lot of appellate work, both here and in the Sixth Circuit, because anybody that ended up in the federal court, if it went up, you know, they hired somebody to do that. And if somebody lost, we got a lot of those appeals. So, I mean, it would not be unusual for me to end up doing a session up there, being up there for a week with 2 appeals to argue or something like that. And
so the Board of Realtors case, we don't have a lot of time, but I do think it's important to talk about this.
Well, my dad had represented the realtors from really when they first were formed here. I took it over. An antitrust case was filed as to the 6% commission and whether that was a trade violation. There were a bunch of those cases filed by certain lawyers that got settlements. Our board wouldn't settle. And so we went to trial. John Nixon was the trial judge, who of course was a brilliant judge, but didn't like to make people unhappy. So I mean, if he ruled against you, he would do so quite quietly. So this is a federal antitrust case where your damages are exorbitant, obviously. They put on their proof, and I didn't think they had proven the case as a matter of law. Ultimately. So at the close of the plaintiff's proof, I stood up and asked to dismiss at the close of the plaintiff's proof. Both sides argued at great length, and Judge Nixon, probably correctly, said, given the standard for ruling at the close of the plaintiff's proof, I deny the motion. And I stood up and said, if Your Honor, please, I stand on my motion, which means we're not putting on proof. And he put his head down and said, granted. And the other table couldn't figure out what had happened. And finally, somebody at the table was saying to him, he just granted the motion. He granted the motion. So we stood on our motion in a federal antitrust case and won, which, you know, when it happens and you win is no big thing. But it was kind of a gutsy moment.
It was gutsy. So I want to talk about 2 other areas that you're doing while you're practicing law. One is being an entrepreneur. Can you talk about what you have done as a lawyer in addition? Obviously, lawyers are entrepreneurs, but non-lawyering entrepreneuring.
Well, again, with my great ability to make decisions without making them, I accidentally kept getting in businesses. So by the time I was 40, I'd been in 16 small businesses. Some of them worked out very well. Some of them worked out very unwell. But I'd been in the restaurant business, I'd been in the bar business, we'd been in the computer business. There were just a variety of different businesses that I'd been in, which fortunately worked out okay financially, but really what it did, it taught you how to be a business person, so it taught you how to advise business people. Whether it was financial issues or employment issues or contracts or partners or whatever, that gave me a real advantage in representing businesses and business people. And you know, I love doing startups. I represent all these startups because the same questions arise today with a startup that arose when we started a restaurant up in 1969.
And on top of practicing law and on top of running businesses, owning and running businesses, you are also very involved in politics. Can you explain why you have been so intricately, well, first of all, explain what your theory is and what your passion is about politics.
Well, that actually came out of when Tommy Wiseman ran for governor in 1974. As you know, Tommy was the person I ran admiring in 68. He ran for governor. I'd always said I'd do anything for him. They, of course, screwed up the list, so they didn't know about it. Somebody called me and asked me to do some minor role, and I ended up running Davidson County for them and doing all this stuff. He should have been governor. The campaign was totally screwed up by the people that they hired at the top from out of town. And I put my heart and soul in it, and we did a lot of amazing things, and were able to pull him into third, but he lost. And I just decided, at that point, I was never going to put my heart and soul in the campaign again if I wasn't in charge of it. And that the key was, I'd sort of been working into this, but that really got me there, that I had to learn how to win campaigns and when you could win them, so that I could help good people decide, one, whether to run for office, and if they run, to elect them. And that really was my driving principle thereafter, was learning how to do elections and win them for good people.
But why was it important for you to see good people, as you say, in office?
I mean, I didn't ever think about it rationally. You obviously want good people rather than ungood people, and the people you knew were the good people. I mean, so sure they ought to get. I mean, my first race that people knew me for was electing Steve Cobb to the legislature, that just was one where, of course, he ended up being one of the great legislators ever. But they had a campaign they were about to get beat in. I came in and did a grassroots operation, and we were fortunate enough to win that one a little less than a year. Well, since we're in the lawyer thing, Charles Ray, the short, fat Charlie Ray, my great friend, was the person that called and said I had to get over there and do the Cobb campaign. So that's how I ended up in that one. Less than a year later, he called and in Charlie Ray fashion, whoop, whoop, Betty Nixon, group. And so I did Betty Nixon's runoff that first race when we did a checkoff at the polls and won by 10 votes. So, I mean, it's classic retail, grassroots operation, determine who's going to vote and get them there, determine who wouldn't vote but would vote for you and get them there. And so we started doing this and winning races, and the rest is kind of history.
Can you just give just a list, and I know it won't be a complete list, of people you have done that very thing for through the years?
Okay, so we've talked about Cobb and Betty Nixon and did various Betty's races. We had Walter Kurtz, who, that public defender's race where we took over the public defender's office because you were mad at the time server who was there. That was kind of an interesting race. At that point, Kurtz was living in Ashley Wiltshire's basement and had never had a job outside of a law school, other than being a lieutenant in the Army. And so the person in there was a legacy of the mayor's office, and nobody knew any of our people, and the week before, 26 council members came out in favor of the incumbent, and we lost 2 boxes in Davidson County. So that was that race. We then had the races where we had Kurtz, of course, getting elected. We had Barbara Haynes. We had John Brown. Of course, along the way, there's Randy Kennedy, there was Claudia, there's
Gail Ray for sheriff.
Gail Ray for sheriff, which was a great one because that was when everybody assumed, all the talking heads said we had to go negative. Of course we're not going negative. We're winning with women, right? Did they like negative? Anyway, so they said it was the greatest upset in history because they said it wasn't going to happen, but there was Gail's races. First, of course, our race for council where we defeated the person who was very disagreeable but was Siegenthaler's best friend and thought was unbeatable. Then, of course, we did the sheriff's race, et cetera.
And then take us through Purcell and
of course, we did the other public defenders races after that, and through that I got to know a guy named Bill Purcell slightly. He came to see me one day and said he was looking to run for the legislature in East Nashville, and he wanted to know would I help him and could he win. And so I said I would look at it, and I came back and I said, well, if you can get a woman to run the race, yes, you can win it. We actually were doing a tactical thing there, but where East Nashville is very organized, and they already had their person that was going to win. But there were newer people moving in, and also the district had been gerrymandered to have Donaldson on the other side of the river, and we thought we could go into Donaldson where they didn't do anything. And anyway, he was such a good candidate that they'd actually won both in East Nashville and in Donaldson. So I did all his legislative races. I then assisted him when he ran for majority leader. And then when he was looking to run for governor, if we could get everything set up. it wouldn't set up, and so the decision was made to run for mayor, and I was able to assist him in that effort.
And you are the creative person who came up with the idea that he would put the desk on the lawn for his commercial, which is
I'm
still
not
cited.
actually, I was the one that said they would be at the lawn. And the desk was not my thought. But we ended up with the best pollster on earth, and we ran a race that everybody thought we were running the wrong race, but it was a grassroots race. Bill is great with humans. He got out and talked to people, and we ended up with him being missing just inches from getting 50%. So that to avoid a runoff, Fulton, who is a person of fabulous character on that evening, you know how disappointing it is when you're the former mayor, he got up on TV and said, I don't know about everybody else, but I'm voting for Bill Purcell. So that Bill became the mayor. Of course, he was reelected, and he did a phenomenal job.
And then speaking of runoff, you were then asked to come in and run the runoff for Carl Dean.
Right, come in and do the opposite of the runoff, for Carl, and that was my runoff plan I had for Bill. I just never used it. It's kind of like the speech you never got to give. I had a runoff plan I'd never done, so I walked in with a runoff plan, and Jim Hester, who had run the campaign and had done a fabulous job, we all just ran that and won it.
And recently, you just helped Dan Martin. We're
Right.
using the same skills that you've used for the past 40 years.
And just, of course, she's a fabulous person. She may be the best candidate ever. Sorry, all of the candidates. But she just had a great team and did a great job.
I just also want to say that you've helped so many women candidates, Janice Santini, Marietta Shipley, just on and on. You've named a few. Why?
Well, for two reasons. One, they obviously were the best person. Two, Margaret Bim told me to. Janice
not what
Santini,
the answer I was looking
she
for.
rode her in on a wheelbarrow into my office, dumped her out, and said, "You're doing her council race." I didn't know her. She didn't know me. It looked like a blind date. We're sitting there looking at each other. Who are you? Who are you? But that was a really fun one because we beat the guy who was the former incumbent and all that stuff out there. And the rest is history, as they say.
You've never been fearful of taking on incumbents, have you?
They usually tend to be lazy.
So, all right, so practicing law, running business, doing politics, and let's talk a little bit about kind of just law firms today. What are you doing today?
Today, I'm just having a wonderful time because I have actually quit trying cases. I was fortunate enough to have a case for a great friend that determined whether he would have plenty of money or be broke, and they were trying to cheat him, and we went through the state Supreme Court, and we won it all the way, including our fees, and I decided, it's probably time to quit, and so that was my last trial. So now I get here in the mornings, 6:30 or 7. I have a wonderful business and planning practice. A lot of my business is established people that have grown up with us. I mean, we grow our clients. But a fair number of business are startups, and so it's really fun working with these young, enthusiastic people that are talking about things I don't understand at all, but the principles are still the same. I'm also here to sort of be the lawyer for our trial people, our appellate people. They can come bounce ideas off of me, and we can bounce them around. Or, having done this for a couple of thousand years, people walk in and say, well, is there a legal principle? You can sort of kind of be everybody's lawyer, and then work with the team in doing our document stuff and all like that, and just have a great time.
You've been a great mentor to a lot of lawyers through the years. People love, associates and partners love to come ask you questions. And so it's not just the clients who love your counseling, but who you work with love it too. Yeah, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the culture of what you try to pass on to other lawyers, the kind of culture and how lawyers should be with their clients and other lawyers.
Well, I mean, it's really simple. With the client, the rule is if you were the client, are you the best choice on earth to be their lawyer? And if the answer is yes, then you ought to have the client. If not, you need to move the client down the road. I mean, so that's both you and the client. But if you were the client and you are the best choice on earth, and that means you're going to know it and work it and do it, yes, that's the client side. Lawyers, you have to have respect for other lawyers, even if they aren't on their best day. You don't email somebody, you call them. The whole thing of treating a lawyer like a different level of human, as they are, because they're our confreres. My trick that you know is before you talk to somebody on the phone, stick your tongue out so you're smiling. Make sure you're smiling in the call. If you're smiling, then it comes through your voice, and you can't make yourself mad, and you can't make them mad, and if they're making you mad, you're still smiling. But it's treating the lawyers with respect and listening to them, even if you think that what they're saying is stupid. But it's a process, and you realize you may be the one the next time that's got a client, and you got to say something stupid. I mean, you treat everybody with dignity. When you're older, younger people really appreciate you treating them with dignity, and that means you can probably get a 10% advantage on them, so there's both tactically and otherwisely, but, you do realize, you always think of yourself as just one of the guys. Now it's turned out they're both guys and gals, and a lot of the guys and gals are actually younger than I am. So you have to realize they have a slightly different view.
Through the years, you have pretty well, let me ask you first this. You didn't stay with
I think she's leading the witness. What do y'all think?
Well, when did you leave your firm?
I left in '85.
And why did you leave? And
it was. I mean, the wonderful people. I mean, that was a great firm, great people. But they were going one direction. They were thinking we ought to go to without having a lot of help, kind of the older version of the practice. And I was simply overwhelmed. I had far more business I could handle. I was getting a reputation for not returning phone calls, and I was working 85 hours a week. I mean, and, there weren't more hours than if you call somebody, it'd be 2 a.m. So it was time to move on. My secretary, still Secretary Lisa, and I left and set up an office. Our overhead was $4,000 a month. She wasn't sure we could cover it because we thought all the business would stay at the old firm. She bought me a whole box of cards, and every time I left to go anywhere, she wanted to know how many cards I'd given away. I made a list of books that I would read in my spare time. I still have the list. And I wrote a letter to all the clients at the old firm saying, bye, know you'll stay with the old firm. It's a great place to be. Enjoy knowing you, bye. Again, with my non-decision making, I had no idea this was brilliant. And half the business came with us. And so then rather than 8 of us handling it, there was 1 of us handling it. I brought in some good young lawyers, and then you and I merged our respective firms in '88, and it's just continued to be wonderful.
And what's your theory about growth of law firms?
Well, I mean, when I left the old firm and all my friends who were with larger firms wanted me to come there, I didn't want to be in a larger firm because I wanted the individual client contact that we have. I mean, and so, some of my clients are rich and some of my clients aren't rich. But I'd always said that if I ever was going to be in a large firm, I would join one, not grow it, because there's a real gap between being 8, 10 like we are and being some of our wonderful large Nashville firms. That gap in there is so hard because you have to build in there. You can't compete down. You got to compete up, and it's just a hard thing to be. So you don't have the fun of being a small firm, but you don't have the momentum of a large firm. So I always wanted to say something like this, where if you're my client and you call over here, you're probably going to get me.
I want you to talk a little bit about your role with some nonprofits, and I'm going to tell you which ones, and you can add anyone, but Triangle House and Rap House and Oasis.
Well, Triangle House was a Sue Ford White project. Sue, of course, is one of the great people on earth, and they needed a residential facility, and it wasn't set up. Nonprofits way back then wasn't set up to do that. So what we did is put together, I came up with the concept to do a limited partnership with a group of people who favored the organization And we were able to borrow the money and buy the house, get it fixed up. And then YW was able to operate out of there for years and years and years that they couldn't have done if they were having to go out and rent a commercial property. So it was a way for using individual supporters to get a permanent facility, which allows, of course, a nonprofit to plan like you can't do if you're sitting in rented space.
But as I recall, at least from what I hear from Sue, that nonprofits were just kind of struggling, and no nonprofit had ever actually purchased real estate.
We couldn't find where anybody had ever done it before, but we weren't smart enough to know that. We just did it.
And with Rap House in Oasis.
Well, of course, Rap House comes out of the late 60s. You feel like this is deja vu all over again. There were right-wing people and left-wing people and young people, and everybody was upset with each other, and there were a lot of runaways, and some of the runaways used drugs, and so we were trying to help both the young people who were of age and these runaways. Runaways were a real problem because there wasn't a place to stay. They'd come to Nashville. They were being terribly taken advantage of. There were none of these facilities we have today. So we'd found a group of individuals, volunteers, who were willing to say, well, if you find a runaway, we'll take him or her in, contact parents, et cetera. And so the police started charging each of those people who did that with contributing to the delinquency of a minor, something that looks great on your resume. So in trying to get there, we had to put something together. The idea came up for what became Rap House. And we got a little bit of money. But remember, there was a lot of split right then. I know it's never happened again. So what we did with Rap House is we did it under the larger scope of the diocese. And we got our money from a law enforcement administration grant through the DA's office. So although we were the hippie agency, we were under the diocese through the DA's office. You can't get more conservative than that. And that's how we managed to get Rap House up and going. So over time, it built into the various things, to the residential center, to what it is today, which is, it's the most amazing agency because it's forever young.
So I want to pivot back to just a couple other areas. One, other things that you're doing in your practice today, and then we're going to talk a little bit about family. So you also teach, and you've had a long career with the Nashville School of Laws. Could you please just talk a little bit about that and what it's meant to you?
It's been wonderful. Again, by planning, I had never taken a wills course. I'd never taken a planning course. I knew nothing about it. It was 1970. My dad, who was teaching it at the National School of Law, had a heart attack, and they said, come in and teach it. So I'm there with Nancy Corley, John McLemore. They're all fourth-year students. They are my age. They know I don't know any wills and planning. So a la the property course, I would read 3 chapters ahead, knowing they wouldn't read more than 2 ahead to try to trip me up. So I have been teaching there ever since. I have loved it. Along the way, I wrote the book, of course, it's the only book on planning in Tennessee. It's 327 pages now that, I update every January, and so that's been an interesting part of that.
You also teach, what else?
Well, teaching at the National School of Law got Bob Crosley to call me about teaching the Bar Review course. So I've been teaching his course and then Barbary up to the present moment on wills and estates, and they've never had a question yet that we hadn't covered in our material. I also do a lot of CLE stuff. I also do timely topics for Barbary. I also am the editor for West Publishing, or Thomson Reuters, who it is now, of the planning and entity LLC corporate et cetera books for them.
So let's talk about your family a little bit. You're married to me.
Yes, I have the name written on my hand so I wouldn't get it wrong.
And we met in the library that we have already talked about.
Right, at the old firm.
At the old firm. My mother was a legal secretary to Mr. Keeble and then to Mr. Harris.
Right.
So I was at your Christmas party.
Right.
And that was kind of special.
Right, the rest, as they say, is history, right? We keep saying that.
And we have 2 children. Talk about them.
We have 2 children. Margaret Virginia, who is one of these people that does what she says she's going to do, and she was a good athlete, competitive. Decided to go to the University of Georgia, which was a fabulous experience. Went to Washington City, was sort of taking over that place. When the T-Mobile, she was AT&T war room person. When they put together the labor, et cetera, side, the lawyers couldn't handle the other side. She decided if you want to take over the world, you got to be a lawyer. So she came back to Vanderbilt Law School, was a real law review person, and is a lawyer at Vesper and Sims. She combines Margaret's ability to deal with humans and solve problems with a very, very, very sharp legal mind. So that's Margaret.
And married to?
She's married to this wonderful guy named Ben Baden, who is one of these rare people. You can sit and listen for 2 hours. He can put everything everybody said into one paragraph that you want to read.
Is great. And what about our other child?
Harlan is 6'8", is one of the more competitive humans you have ever met. Made himself into a college basketball player. Got to Williams, play up there, started 3 years, took them to the NCAA Final Four twice, and just is he is one of those people who does amazing things. He also has got literally a photographic mind and is real analytical. So he decided, he'd always said he was going to teach, and so he, after he graduated, began teaching and coaching up in the that boarding school, upper level boarding school world in the Northeast, where players are going D1 and all of that. At 26, he took a head coaching job in one of those schools and has rebuilt that program. He got a Teacher of the Year award at the first school. He, in 3 years, was teaching senior AP stuff at this school, and is moving back to Nashville with his wonderful wife, Laura, who is gotten her PhD in record time in psychology with an emphasis in early detection and early intervention in autism. She will be here with the Vanderbilt Kennedy Center grouping, which is, of course, heaven for such a specialty. And so he is returning here to teach and coach.
And no grandchildren yet, right?
Right.
So you're 73, and you're practicing law full-time.
Yes.
And why is that?
Well, I mean, it's like I make everything carefully deciding long in advance. It's, what the heck would I do? I love it, and my clients need a lawyer.
And could you just reflect, as the last question, what has been the rewards and advantages of you being a lawyer?
Well, I think the first advantage is, of course, you get paid real well and don't have to work very hard. You don't have to lift anything, don't have to work outside. But I think the real advantage is, if somebody's mistreating somebody, you can just walk over there and do something about it. And, that's whether it's a major case or a minor case or whatever, as a lawyer, you're the only person that has a right to step in and represent somebody else's interest. And you've always got that.
Thanks, Harlan.
All right.
I could talk to you another hour and a half.
Well, it's kind of fun to think about all this stuff.